again. I would like to talk a little bit about integrative, complementary, and alternative medical approaches and strategies that we utilize in the context of inpatient psychiatry. And I want to do that in relation to our most current research studies, one focused on exercise in inpatient psychiatry, and the other one, the upcoming olfactory virtual reality study. So one thing that is very important to understand is that from the perspective of medicine applied to a psychological well-being, we need to understand the biopsychosocial model very, very well. Now, the biopsychosocial model is a model that's been discussed for many, many years, I would say for decades at this point, and it's a model that is very holistic in a sense that it, as the name implies, is focused on a biological model, and biological model can be transferred into neural underpinnings of behavior, a topic that I discussed several times in many other videos, especially the one of the series on critical neuroscience. Then the social model, because mental health is also a social issue, a relationship, a relation toward the other person that from a philosophical standpoint is the other from me, to me, towards me, and I'm thinking about Levinas in the context of philosophy. And of course the psychological component that in the West for the most part is almost synonymical with behavioristic model. And why is that? Well, the reason is that the core psychotherapeutic presentation within the medical efforts in an inpatient psychiatry unit is based on CBT and DBT. I would say for 85-90% of the groups offered on a unit. CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, of course, and DBT stands for dialectic behavioral therapy. Now, why in the context of what we do, we decided to go beyond this standardization of care? Well, there are several reasons. One is that behavioral psychotherapy is by definition somewhat restricting the opportunities of intervention, in a sense that CBT, for instance, it's extremely good at targeting, as the name implies, our thoughts and our actions, but of course it does not dig as deep as other psychological modalities. Now, the good thing is also these other psychological modalities, and I'm thinking of analytic modalities, psychodynamic modalities, psychoanalytic modalities, require a very, very long and profound type of intervention that it's very, very difficult to implement in the context of group therapy, for instance. And it also rests upon certain philosophical assumptions that are not easily verifiable from the perspective of evidence-based science, again, in the context of evidence-based medicine, the way it's practiced, at least in the West, or at least here in the United States. Now, since behavioral psychology has its good and bad aspects, so to speak, something we like to do is to implement those aspects so that we will be able to better reach this holistic presentation of our therapeutic intervention to our patient. We talk a lot about exercise, physical exercise, in the context of group therapy, and we did that starting from the several studies we conducted on the unit, but especially the most recent one with the focus on the recommendation of the American College of Sports Medicine, the study by Tomasi, Gates, and Ryans. This new study on olfactory virtual reality was made possible again by the wonderful efforts of the University of Vermont Medical Center, especially within the inpatient psychiatry unit, with the support, of course, of the Clinical Research Center and all the leadership, starting with Dr. Toby Horn at the inpatient psychiatry unit. This is a research that focuses on providing the best strategy to fill the gap between cortical activation, which is the realm of cognitive and behavioral therapy, and limbic system activation, we could say. Now, olfactory virtual reality It's a wonderful tool that we have, a tool that combines, of course, olfactory bulb stimulation, so our sense of smell, one of the primordial senses we have, the sense that almost completely bypasses the thalamus, so it has this capacity to trigger memories and emotional responses without having the same level of cognitive apprehension and analysis that verbal talk therapy has on one side. And on the other side, of course, virtual reality. Virtual reality in the context of course, occipital lobe activation, so our visual cortex, our ability to detect information from the environment. An environment, however, is not just bidimensional. We're not talking just about a picture. We're talking about a picture in motion, just as a movie we are fully taking part in. And this is something that is as wonderful from the perspective of advancement of technology, but also wonderful to provide, this is the most important thing, at least in my mind, provide something for individuals who will be otherwise not able to engage in other therapeutic modalities. And this is the case, of course, of physical exercise. So for patients that are bedridden and might have a series of medical comorbidities on top of psychiatric problems, and that are prevented from engaging in this more holistic, integrative approach because they cannot fully engage in physical activity. Now, within virtual reality, of course, we're talking about a technological advancement, and in other videos, I mentioned the healthy skepticism we should have, of course, toward new technological advancement. And I mentioned that also from the philosophical standpoint. I mentioned many times Aristotle and the tripartite model of knowledge, in which you have science as technology, of course, which is what OVR allows us for, or olfactory virtual reality as technological advancement. So science as technology, but also science as episteme, so the study of science, epistemological aspect, understanding what is science and how science works. And this is to some extent synonymous of the application of the scientific method, the principle of falsifiability, the hierarchy of evidence, but also science as phronesis. Now, phronesis is something that, in my opinion, is not well thought of, or at least we don't spend too much time discussing that aspect within the medical field, and we usually relegate to some extent the aspect within biomedical ethics, bioethics, and it's really unfortunate because it's something that we should always consider to be the primary goal of patient treatment. After all, we always think about having a patient at the center of therapy, and so it makes sense that this prudence, this somewhat imprecise translation of phronesis, should be the center of our therapeutic efforts. And why do I mention that? Well, I mention that because one of the things to keep in mind is that for every technological advancement, on one side we do have indeed progress, but we also have to some extent a regress. Now, I don't want to have the public understand that as a somewhat conspiratorial component of the discussion, in a sense that progress doesn't exist and science it's not accurate. By no means I intend that I am a strong proponent of scientific method in all fields of science, including medical sciences. But of course, there's something to be said where there is a technological advancement, there is a cognitive shortcut, if I permit the term, a shortcut that would allow us to reach a previously unimagined level of intervention, but at the expense of other neurocognitive, neurobehavioral aspects of ourselves. I want to illustrate, for example, we're talking about technologies such as virtual simulation, right? And so this is phenomenal because it allows us to entertain a new presence of self within an environment that's created from scratch, a virtual environment by definition, so that we don't have to be there physically. We don't have to be there for real as stemming from the res, the res, the Latin root. So we don't have to be physically present. And so, of course, because of that, we are separated physically from the present. And so this is a downside, of course, because it prevents us from utilizing all our senses in the way nature created our organic system to function with in the first case. Now, this should not be taken necessarily against what we're trying to do from the perspective of research, in a sense that we have to simply be aware of the limitations and the possible negative implications, also in the context of nocebo effects when utilizing any type of technology. The same, of course, is applicable to any type of electronic devices. I stress multiple times in the context of clinical psychology the intrinsic dangers of overexposure to screen time, how negative the impact is on the appropriate neurocognitive and neuroemotional and behavioral development of our children when our children spend too much time in front of a screen. I can't stress that enough. But at the same time, we could go back in time and think about certain limitation in the context of imaginative powers where the first books were printed. So, the fact that we are able to actually read a language is to some extent a limitation of our poetic possibilities, poetic in an etymological sense, is creative, imaginative possibilities, because we rely on a script. After all, that's what books are about. And of course, nobody would ever advise against utilization of books for fostering human knowledge in all fields, and also for entertainment, for leisure activities. But it's important to understand that we are adding on one side and we are losing on the other side, so that these laws can be fully reintegrated once our system allows it for, in the context of, again, this biopsychosocial model that is nothing new, really. It's the model that traditionally has been utilized in all form of folk traditional ethnomedicine, and the same model that we are rediscovering in our modern world when we talk about integrative, complementary, and alternative medicine. So, to summarize, we will have to pay a very, very solid attention to the need of a solid scientific method, an evidence-based method, the pyramid of evidence, in any type of research we want to utilize in the context of clinical intervention, but also at the same time understanding that science, it is not only a question of technology, right? Now, we might not fully agree with this Aristotelian perspective of phronesis, techne, and episteme in the context of science, but we should at least understand that knowledge, it's not just defined by the tools we utilize to achieve that sense of complete wisdom, if I can use this term.
Okay, here's the OVR Technology Campsite, one of my favorite places in the world. It's chilly in here. I'll get a campfire going. That's better. Now it's getting warmer. Here, take this. There's the marshmallows.
All things considered, I do believe that we are reaching a groundbreaking time in our scientific efforts toward health and well-being, and also because there is a social aspect toward the application of such technology. I'm thinking again about olfactory virtual reality that will also help bridge the gap between socioeconomic status differences, between geographic differences, between the rich and the poor, so kind of a social class type of environment that will make everybody equal, at least from the perspective of technological application. So regardless of your bank account, your socio-cultural background, your level of education, we could say, this technology will allow us to bridge the gap between us and the otherness, so that we can recover this intimate sense of self that is fully based on our matter, on our senses. We're not necessarily tricking our brain, if tricking is to be considered in a negative sense, but we are allowing our inner structure that the brain utilizes in an everyday activity to emphasize certain aspects against the backdrop and the negative effects of certain traumatic experiences, for instance. So we are recovering from the core. And this is especially true in the context of the application of olfactory virtual reality for mental health, PTSD especially, depression and mood disorders in general. It's one way to go back in time in a safe and nurturing way. After all, in the context of trauma, we do utilize several psychotherapeutic techniques that are focused on progressive nurturing exposure with relapse prevention. But of course, one of the main issues is how can we be re-exposed to a traumatic event to learn from it, learn not just cognitively speaking, but through our body. Our bodies have their own body intelligence, they have their own emotional intelligence, and they have their own gastrointestinal intelligence or cognitive intelligence, so on and so forth. So virtual reality is allowing us to recreate a virtual environment that lives within us, because that's one of the issues with our work toward trauma. The fact that we are carrying the trauma with us wherever we go. Even if the trauma is not there physically to haunt us, the presence of the trauma is virtually there all the time, or at least it's triggered by certain audiovisual stimuli, for instance, that will throw us back to that time of the abuse, of the trauma. And so virtual reality is doing just that. Notwithstanding the importance of experiencing the vast majority of our life in person, using our senses for real, something that we always emphasize, starting from a very young age, from the perspective of a healthy neurodevelopmental perspective, okay? Less screen time, less technology, more in-person experiences. At the same time, if we do have the opportunity, let me use this term, to work with individuals that have been victims of traumas or have been suffering from this type of mental health disorder, olfactory virtual reality is yet another technological tool in our hands to make the lives of millions of people much better from, again, the emotional, the cognitive, the behavioral, and the holistic perspective. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.